Just a few more seconds. Is Kashi back?
Not yet.
Okay. Rajiv sir, you can also start recording whenever you are ready in another few seconds. Okay, we are ready.
Back.
We are ready to start at any time. Yashasni, all yours.
Yes.
All the best, both the teams. We will see you soon.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the finals of the Rotary Debate 2021. On-site government, we have the Bluebell School International, and the team comprises of Amna Halim, Arnav Kalbhor, and Devi Sankla. On-site opposition, we have La Martiniere Boys, and the team comprises of Arav Midha, Nikhilesh Mukherjee, and Pradyumna Nahata. I congratulate both the teams for having made it thus far, and we look forward to a great debate. The motion being debated on the floor of the House today is this House will accept individual suffering for evolutionary progress. And I request the Prime Minister to open the case for side government.
Right, so I'll start my speech in 2, 3. Panel, today we're living in a world where we are clearly leeching off the benefits of evolutionary process. For example, let's talk about the agricultural revolution that was mentioned in the context, right? Today we have a systematic way of agriculture. Let's take another example of the green revolution, like we're talking about better forms of irrigation, we're talking about HIV seeds, all of these things have helped agriculture to further develop as an industry, and today we're clearly leeching of the benefits of these evolutionary processes. So what are evolutionary processes? What is evolutionary progress? We're defining evolutionary progress as a change for development, a change for progress, and I think it is important to recognize and accept that progress comes with its consequences. So when we're saying that we'll accept individual suffering for evolutionary progress, that's not to say that we are that we are glorifying suffering, but we are conceding to the on side proposition, we're only conceding to the fact that individual suffering will follow and the name of development. Not in any way are we glorifying the statement, but we're conceding to this fact, and we will and side government we're sort of propagating the idea that this loss and sacrifice is not forgotten, right? We're still talking about these evolutions and how they've helped us in our society to progress, that these sacrifices and laws are not forgotten, and we do respect them and honor people who had to suffer for our benefit and for the benefit of future generation. Which brings me to my first constructive. My first constructive is that individual suffering in a way is sort of inevitable, which is to say that it's impossible to develop without individual suffering. That brings me to further elaborate this argument by saying that development is subjective for a community. What constitutes development for one community might harm the other. So if side opposition comes here and proposes that there will be no individual suffering, this leading towards the fact that there will be no development, and we've stated that that is not possible by saying that it is inevitable. This means that this leads us what the model that side opposition will propose or will stand for as part of their burden is to say that they live in a state of stagnation, right? Where meaning that they live in a state of stagnation, meaning that their development will not come with some sort of cost. The world that the opposition will build and the burden that they stand for is a world of stagnation. Why is stagnation wrong, right? Because stagnation will lead to individual suffering. That's what we saw in the communist revolution. We saw how when there is no need for change and no one wants to change, right? That in itself leads to individual suffering. Therefore, the most vulnerable in this debate are not being protected on the opposition side, and we on side proposition are simply against that. Let's talk about another argument and how we are protecting the most vulnerable stakeholders. Who starts these evolutionary changes? It's not people sitting in the ivory tower starting these evolutionary changes. Think about the French Revolution, for example. It was the third estate that stood for their rights, and that brought and that brought out French Revolution, right? They were against the status quo at that point. They were against aristocracy at that point, and they began and sprung up this revolution. And therefore, on our side of the house, we are supporting causes like this because their individual suffering is helping better outcomes for societies that follow. Today, we live in a world where we enjoy the rights that democracy provides us. We enjoy the right to vote, right? But how did this come through? This came through sacrifice, and on our model that we're supporting, we're talking about mitigating human suffering, but we're also but we believe that it's imperative to recognize that we cannot live in a world without human suffering, because that will not lead to change. We're talking about that will not lead to change, which bring me to my final argument, talking about how human suffering is essential to change, right? We're talking, let's take the pandemic, for example. If it hadn't happened, vaccines wouldn't have come up. More important issues wouldn't have been dealt with. We wouldn't have dealt with a world crumbling. We wouldn't have dealt with the issues at hand. And therefore, a lot of these evolutionary changes have sprung up due to the problems that existed in society, and that no one talked about, and that human suffering that took place after that dealt with those issues. On our side of the house, we're supporting the most vulnerable by giving them a voice, right? We're giving them a platform. We're supporting better outcomes for the future that whose benefits we are reaping of, right? We're reaping of democracy, equality. We're reaping of urban societies that have been built through industrial revolution, through the principles of justice and liberty, which these changes have been ignited by the people who suffered yesterday for like a for a better tomorrow. And therefore we believe that we're helping the most vulnerable, and we're having better outcomes for society, and we believe that development cannot be bereft of human suffering. With that, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Amna, for that fine speech. In case you wish to ask a POI, you can use the raise hands option, the way Nikhilesh and Pradyumna did. And if the speaker wishes to take that POI, you can just let that know by saying that, yes, I would like to take this POI now. I would like to take Pradyumna's POI now. I would now request the Leader of Opposition to open the case from side opposition.
Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Yes, perfectly.
All right. A very good evening to one and all present here. Respected Chairperson, ma'am, honorable judges, members of the House, and of course, my most worthy opponents. The topic raised before us today reads that this House will accept individual suffering for evolutionary progress. And I, being the Leader of Opposition, will prove to you how baseless and invalid this topic really is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can draw several parallels with this topic from the Orbilian Argument, which states that any revolution with an individual suffering as its base is bound to fail. Let's look at several examples from history. We've got the Soviet Union, where leaders like Joseph Stalin mercilessly murdered their political rivals in order to gain supremacy. Now, they may have gotten initial success. Yes, they may have gotten what they wanted, political success. But what they failed to do was to ensure that this act of individual suffering which they have inflicted on others has not resulted in the change that they perceive to be. He perceived Russia to be a utopian state, the superpower of the world, the greatest economy that has ever existed. But ladies and gentlemen, did that happen? No. With just cement side opposition's point, with saying that how individual suffering is not useful, is not a helpful tool for evolutionary progress. Now, we have seen several examples in the past as well. We've seen the French Revolution, which saw the rise of the middle class and the merciless murder of the proletariats. We've seen it in Animal Farm, a George Orwell book, and which clearly shows how individual suffering is not helpful for evolutionary progress in the long run. Now, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to side opposition's second tenet, which shows that people who voluntarily give up their lives are not facing individual suffering. Now, let me give you an example. We've all read about the Indian freedom movement. We've all read tales of the heroic freedom fighters giving up their lives for the motherland. But ladies and gentlemen, can we consider this to be individual suffering? Can we consider this to be an effort for a further evolutionary progress? No, because they have voluntarily given up their lives in order to achieve what they morally stand for, what they and a large number of people fighting by their side morally stand for. We've heard of stories of Bhagat Singh. We've heard of stories of several freedom fighters who voluntarily given up their lives for the sake of the motherland, for the principle that they wanted to achieve, which is the freedom of India. Now, moving on to the third and final tenet of side opposition. about how the infliction of individual suffering may put people in a position of power, and in their hands lies the power to discriminate on whether this person's individual suffering is worth it or not. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've all heard of the impacts of the American slavery. We've all heard horrific stories. We've seen movies. We've seen it. We've read in books about how slaves were mistreated, how the sufferings that they had to go through just to work and just to and just to get these people the profits they wanted. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the slave owners consider themselves to be on a position of power where they could decide the fate of these slaves that they owned. But, ladies and gentlemen, just for the sake of improving the American economy, just for the sake of earning profits, can we consider this individual sacrifice, this individual suffering to be a testament to the evolutionary progress as discussed in today's motion? Now, we've all heard about the Soviet Union. We have given examples on the freedom movement. But after all this, can we still consider individual suffering to be a suitable substitute for a collective suffering that human beings go through every day? By individual suffering, we don't only mean by evolutionary progress, we don't only mean the biological progress we all go through. We also talk about social progress. We also talk about social change. We talk about a change in the mindset of the people after going through all the sufferings that they have been inflicted upon. We've all heard about the LGBTQ movement. All of these people were persecuted around 100 years ago. But today we see a change in mindset. Today we see a complete change in the school of thought with respect to this community, because we have accepted this as a result of the suffering that they have gone through. This has led to a new window of change. And this has resulted in us being a more open society, a more accepting society. And with all this being said, ladies and gentlemen, can we still consider that that individual suffering is worth it when it comes to evolutionary progress? Now, my second speaker will elaborate on what I've spoken about today, and I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. I would now like to request the Deputy Prime Minister to further the case on site government.
Right, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Greetings to the House at large. Through the course of my speech, I intend to do two things. The first of which is to rebut the points made by side opposition, and the second of which is to further the constructives on side proposition. Now, side opposition constantly talked about how individual suffering is unacceptable, but completely ignored the fact that individual suffering still happens in the status quo. Even if we imagine a society without evolutionary progress, which I'm going to be talking about how is completely impossible in my second constructive, even if we imagine such a society, people are still going to be suffering in the status quo, which is something that my first speaker mentioned and which is something that they completely did not engage with us on. They've given us examples like the LGBT movement, but have ignored the LGBT movement, but have ignored the fact that individual suffering obviously happened, and how this is not really relevant to what we were talking about right today. Now, our first speaker clearly demonstrated how individual suffering is inevitable, even in a society that maintains the status quo and does not progress. What I'm now going to talk about in my first constructive is the outcome of this individual progress and the benefits on our side of the house in order to establish the need for evolutionary progress. We see that throughout history, certain communities and people have oppressed others and created systems that marginalize and hurt certain groups. These groups, therefore, were forced to overthrow their oppressors in radical uprisings. This, of course, caused individual suffering, but it was necessary in order to protect principles like liberty, equality, and democracy. Moreover, these people who were marginalized were already suffering. So to say that individual suffering did not exist and only arose as a direct cause of this evolutionary progress is completely and demonstrably false. To give an example, let's talk about the French Revolution, in which the most marginal, in which the worst off within society, that is the third estate, overthrew the elite within society. Of course, individual suffering was caused to the elite. Of course, we saw that in Robespierre in his reign of terror. However, this was required in order to protect the third estate, which was systematically getting terrorized by the first estates. We saw this in the freedom movement, where Indians overthrew the British and established sovereignty and democracy of India. Of course, there was suffering on the side of Britain, not only on the side of India, they've talked about how individual martyrs and people choosing to give up their lives do not count, but there was suffering on the side of Britain. But there was bound to be suffering in order to protect the most vulnerable within society, and in order to establish principles such as liberty, equality, and justice. Therefore, we see that individual society is required in order to protect the interests of the worst off in society. Moreover, we'd like to ask side opposition, what is the alternative to this? That the most vulnerable, that the most marginalized continue to suffer, continue to remain oppressed in order to not cause individual suffering to whom? Their oppressors? We completely reject this notion. Now, the government is not unaware that individual suffering is unequal, and movements and landmarks in history tend to benefit the elite more and cause suffering to the elites lesser than the common man. However, we believe that progress means more representation, more freedom, and more affluence for all in the long run. And this brings me to our second outcome, which is long-term benefits, which is that future generations will live in a society where things such as freedom, equality, justice are protected. Future generations will live in a society which is able to make leaps in technology. They'll be able to prevent, they will and have been able to prevent disease and technology that aids us all, thereby minimizing individual suffering in the long run. Now, this brings me to my second, coming to my second constructive, which talks about why evolutionary progress is inevitable. Because with the course of time, society, culture, technology will become more and more complex, i.e. there will be evolutionary progress. We've established why evolutionary progress and individual suffering therefore is inevitable. So all that we can do is minimize this individual suffering. What does this minimization and mitigation look like? This minimization looks like better systems of care. This minimization looks like setting up structures that protect the bottom line. This looks like having better planning and forethought in order to see what the consequences of these actions will look like. This looks like a developer who is trying to cause economic progress, thinking about what the impact of his will have on the weakest rungs of society and ensuring that the weakest rungs of society are the least affected, i.e. keeping in mind the interest and the impact of policies on the most vulnerable within society. Therefore, we on side proposition believe that there is no alternative to evolutionary progress. There is no alternative to individual suffering. Even on their side of their house, even in a world where evolutionary progress does not happen, people are still suffering even within the status quo. We have shown you why the benefits of evolutionary progress far outweigh the cost, and we've told you how on our side of the house we're shifting our focus into trying to minimize individual suffering, because to minimize it, we first have to accept that individual suffering is going to happen as long as there is evolutionary progress. That's why proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, Devi. I would now like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to further the case on side opposition.
Good evening, everyone. Am I clearly audible and visible?
Yes.
Thank you. Today, what is wrong with the proposition's analysis of individual suffering and how it plays into the process of evolutionary progress is what is wrong with individual suffering and how it plays into the process of evolutionary progress. Let us firstly understand what the proposition is saying at its very essence. It is regarding happiness. It's regarding well-being as a quantifiable quantity. Today, the suffering you cause for a minority of the population is less than the happiness that a majority of the population derives as a result of that supposed evolutionary progress. You have X amount of happiness, you have Y amount of suffering, X is more than Y, therefore you have net happiness. Understand, this is a diluted and completely wrong understanding of happiness, morality, and utilitarianism at its worst. Today, I, being on the side of opposition, cannot stand with such a flawed reading of morality, history, and humanity, and instead we will provide an opposite case and show to you how accepting individual suffering is going against the concept of revolution, and we cannot have a process of evolutionary progress and accepting individual suffering in a process of evolutionary progress is something that is simply inexcusable today. Why do I say so? My first point is about how individual suffering inflicted on someone else ultimately destroys a revolution. Why? Today, proposition has assumed that in a community, this revolution and progress is agreed upon by everyone, and the morals held by the people who are coming to power as a result of this revolution are the true morals, are the best morals. Today, basically what happens in a process of evolutionary progress is an old system gets discarded and a new system comes in its place. In the process of transition, in the power struggle, certain people gain more power, and they are the people who ultimately sway the fate of humanity. What is basically happening is by accepting individual suffering, you are giving way to moral objectivity. You are giving way to these people who have simply gained power through this process of transition to decide who suffers, to decide which individual suffering is inflicted upon. And this is something that we cannot tolerate in any, we cannot tolerate simply for the sake of so-called societal welfare. Let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, something that changed our society entirely. Yes, the people who came to power as a result of it justified it, saying it increased the standard of living, it brought economic prosperity, but we must also talk about the immense environmental harm it caused, and we must also talk about the people who are working in factories. Understand that in a process of evolutionary progress, the people who suffer individually, who decides to inflict suffering on them? Those who unjustly gain power, and by accepting it, we are accepting moral objectivity, and that too moral objectivity in the hands of those who recently gained power as a result of this process of evolutionary progress. Let us also talk about the process of discrimination which can arise as a result of this. Now, today they painted the French Revolution as a very good thing. Guillotines are good because they give us liberty, justice, equality, fraternity. But understand that history is not so black and white, and it cannot be diluted to suit your case. Understand that after the French Revolution, everything was not good. Everyone did not benefit. And immediately after the French Revolution, we had someone coming in through the democratic process and then taking power as the king, that is Napoleon. And he caused the death of a lot of his soldiers. Understand that today, side proposition advocating moral objectivity and discrimination in the hands of a few powerful by simply calling them previously vulnerable, formerly vulnerable, and therefore simply changing the dynamics of the society in name, but remaining them to be same but letting them be the same by accepting individual suffering. Thirdly, let me talk about sacrifice. Today's side proposition said sacrifice is necessary for evolutionary progress. I understand that. I agree with that. But sacrifice is not suffering. Understand that when you support a cause and when you're ready to give up your life for the cause, when you're ready to suffer for the cause, when you're ready to endure torture for that cause, when you're actually enduring torture, when you're actually suffering, you're not in fact suffering, you're in fact gaining pleasure, you're in fact gaining moral pride, you're in fact gaining ideological vindication by doing the right thing for the cause you believe is true. Today, proposition essentially wants to further a utilitarian narrative and saying that those people who ultimately profit as a result of evolutionary progresses are people who are previously vulnerable, not understanding that accepting individual suffering allows these very vulnerable people, once they come to power, to continue that process of individual suffering. They advocate moral objectivity on the side of the person who benefits from the evolutionary progress, while pitting moral objectivity against the person who suffers as a result of the evolutionary progress. They talked about stagnation in Russian society and how there were many deaths because there was no progress. But understand that this Russian society was in fact brought about by such a progress that came at expense of individual suffering, that came at the expense of killing a lot of people, thereby presenting an entirely self-defeating point. Today's side opposition affirms that individual suffering cannot be accepted in the process of evolutionary progress, and affirms the Orwellian idea that revolution is deemed useless in the light of individual suffering being accepted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, Nikhilesh. I would now request the government whip to summarize the case on side government.
Gladly. Am I audible and visible properly? Is everything in order?
Yes.
Very well. You can start timing me in 3, 2, 1. Throughout the course of this debate, we as side proposition have proven and demonstrated that the benefits of individual suffering outweighs the benefits of individual suffering for society as a whole and for the human race as a whole outweighs the cost that one person individually suffering can bring. Now, now to summarize the case of side opposition in one line: revolution with individual suffering just don't work at all. Now we can better analyze our case by comparing the several paradigms that this debate exists in through points of clashes. There were two main clashes in this debate. The first main clash is which side will allow for more progress, and second main clash is which side will allow for a better conversation on suffering. Now let us discuss the first clash about which side allows for more progress. through the mass movements of industrial revolution and agricultural revolution was how humanity was brought from discovering fire to launching rockets into space, ladies and gentlemen. It is through that we have uplifted ourselves. We have made perfect use of the human instinct to develop, to expand, to move up the social ladder. This main human instinct is being addressed more on our side. Yes, other human beings on a personal level have been tortured, have suffered. We do agree. However, we most definitely respect them. We honor them in a modern society, in a society where we currently give a lot of precedence to history, and which is why we believe that this clash falls on our side. Secondly, which side allows for a better conversation on suffering? Our side, we are conceding to the fact that individual suffering will happen. Or even though you characterize that mass of that the Indian freedom struggle consisted of mass suffering of many people, but if you nitpick from that crowd, everyone had an individual level of suffering. Many people went to jail, many people lost contact with their families, and that all boiled down to individuality. On our side, we feel that this clash falls towards us because we are allowing for a better conversation on suffering. We are not completely denying that suffering doesn't exist. We are honoring it, ladies and gentlemen. There were several themes in this debate. The first main theme was about the benefit of progress. We saw no engagement from side opposition, I'm sorry to say, about this, which is why we believe that our progress or benefits outweighing the cost in the benefit of progress. Our argument on that stands. Secondly, about you did specifically talk about individual suffering. However, you did specifically mention individual suffering in a very grave and dark manner, but we must rebut this by saying that if individual suffering took place, or people knew what they were sacrificing their lives for and knew that they are individually suffering right now, so that the lives of their children can be further benefited in what way they are sacrificing. Their entire case is based on the Orwellian argument that revolution without suffering will fail. Yes, Stalin caused the Holodomor and he purged several people, and the Soviet Union did eventually fall. However, you are completely negating the fact that it was a world superpower who was successful in providing us with several ideologies which shaped the modern world. Now, if we go towards a best case, worst case analysis, even if we consider their best case where individual suffering is not accepted, for evolutionary progress, we will see a world ripe with stagnation. Yes, I would like to take your POI. Please, Nilesh, I would like to take your POI.
Yes, you stated that you respect the people who suffered during evolutionary progress. Do you respect the oppressive aristocracy that was guillotined during the French Revolution? Do you honor them?
Okay, now to talk about your part of French Revolution, what is an alternative to the French Revolution? How else would you incite revolution in a country if there are no guillotines? If there are no guillotines, exactly. But would you rather have the third estate starving to death? Okay, now continuing my analysis of their best case, yes, there will be a world ripe with stagnation. It will be a world where human instinct of expanding forward won't be fulfilled. People, due to this, people will feel lackluster, and humanity's course of history wouldn't exactly take place. Whereas even in our worst case, yes, there is suffering, there is individual suffering, and people do lose out. Certain people, small people, do lose out on a lot. But the benefits, like I previously mentioned, outweigh the cost. Humans will expand. They will do more benefit for society. And in our world, with this constantly happening, we are reducing suffering as a whole. Yes, there is some individual suffering, but we are reducing suffering as a whole. Continuously, disease is being eradicated. There is a better system of care is constantly being designed. Which is why, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I like to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech, Arnav. I would now call upon the whip speaker from side opposition to summarize the case for side opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Ladies and gentlemen, the history of humanity is the history of conflict between classes. Who said that? Karl Marx. Now, understand the fact that there are two principles that the proposition condones. One, that suffering should take place for evolutionary progress. Second, we do not want the marginalized to stay marginalized. If you don't see any hypocrisy in these two statements, please understand that these statements are inherently illogically, they are logically inconsistent. First, you have to accept two truths if you want to debate this motion. First, conflict always forwards evolutionary progress. Conflict is the permanent presence throughout humanity. What side opposition has today has done is that it has somehow condoned conflict to forward evolutionary progress, while at the same time saying that the marginalized should not face conflict and they should forward evolutionary progress for themselves. Understand that conflict will always exist in a movement towards evolutionary progress. Second, accepting individual suffering means endorsing one side. Accepting evolutionary progress means endorsing that side which wins in the conflict for evolutionary progress. You cannot take a side while at the same time staying completely neutral. A is not equal to B. Their first principle is that we today are leeching off the benefits of evolutionary progress, and progress comes with individual suffering, and if we do not condone that, we are living in a world of stagnation. Ladies and gentlemen, today side opposition makes a bold statement. We understand that evolutionary progress is inevitable. We never said that it is inevitable. We never said that it is avoidable. Today's motion is essentially moralistic. Can we accept individual suffering as the cost for evolutionary progress? Can we accept it? Will you voluntarily witness someone involuntarily dying in a whirlpool of bloodshed for a revolution that inflicts suffering on the other class and therefore endorses itself as the mechanism forwarding evolutionary progress? They talk about the French Revolution. However, understand that the very moral problem which was there in the French Revolution in the 1780s was that it incorporated a culture of killing. It incorporated a culture of conflict. That is why France did not achieve ideal democracy. What did it achieve? It achieved Napoleon. It achieved the Paris Commune, which essentially unfolded throughout the 19th century and therefore wrecked France with this culture of conflict. Secondly, when you endorse such an argument, you endorse a utilitarian argument, an argument associated with the ideals of Mussolini. Who decides who dies? Ladies and gentlemen, if there is going to be conflict and if you are going to endorse conflict for evolutionary progress simply is the unfolding of history. And when you endorse evolutionary progress, you have to endorse one side. And the fact of the matter is that this evolutionary progress comes about by chance, comes about by both chance and as well as free agency. Therefore, you have to understand that if side proposition comes to this debate and says that today we are leeching off of evolutionary progress, maybe considering that we today are living in rich houses, there might be a communist revolution, and one day we might fall ourselves. We might be involved in bloodshed ourselves. Therefore, we also have to endorse that we will suffer, not only those who have died. Endorsing a logically consistent argument means that what happens to one person happens to everybody and this should be justified. Therefore, if killing those who are already dead is justified, then killing ourselves who are alive is also justified by side proposition's case. Their major argument is that the marginalized continue to suffer at the cost of the ruling classes. However, understand that if suffering has to be inflicted on others, then suffering can be inflicted on ourselves as well. This is a Marxist eternity. This is the clash between proposition and opposition. Today, what proposition is doing is that it is endorsing two sides. It is endorsing the minimization of individual suffering, which their second speaker brought up. They said that obviously what we can do is that we can minimize individual suffering. When they say that we can want to minimize individual suffering, they accept that individual suffering is undesirable. Today we are not talking about what is real, we're talking about what is acceptable. And when side proposition makes even the smallest claim like that, their argument becomes logically inconsistent. Today this debate boils down to the notion of objective morality. Is morality objective or not? And as humanity, as stakeholder, all our arguments have to be logically consistent. And today's side proposition has taken two sides. At the very base of their argument is a dichotomy which endorses both individual suffering as well as the subsistence of the marginalized. But that is essentially why it fails. Ladies and gentlemen, what is acceptable is universally moral. You can endorse history while endorsing objective morality. And you cannot do both. And that is why side proposition, not being only logically inconsistent, essentially collapses its own argument. And with that, I'd like to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradyumna, for that fine speech. I would now call upon the reply speaker from side opposition. Okay, Nikhilesh.
So may I start?
Whenever you're ready.
Good evening again. Today, the case of the proposition in this debate can be boiled down to one phrase: the benefits outweigh the costs. Let's look at the analysis and the groundwork they have given for making such an egregious statement. Who are the benefits for in a process of evolutionary progress which involves individual suffering? It's for the people who have gained the power through this process to inflict the suffering on the others. When you talk about benefits within a society, it's not as if A, B, and C social classes in the society have the same amount of benefit. Today, A, which gains power as a result of the society, has much more benefits than B and C, who may be oppressed again as a result of this new evolutionary process, because A believes that this is the way that humanity progresses. Therefore, the idea of benefits is, first of all, there is disparity when it comes to the distribution of benefits in any society after any change in society. Secondly, they have assumed that happiness, well-being can be added up. And if there are 6 people who are happy and there are 4 people who are dead and who are involuntarily suffering, then just because 6 people are happy, 6 minus 4 is 2. Therefore, you have a net worth of 2 happiness, and therefore society progresses. Individual suffering is morally justified, and today they are on moral right ground. Understand that this cannot hold, because first of all, we cannot play with suffering. We cannot play with such basic and fundamental ideas, which is exactly what the proposition has tried to do today through its misreading of history. They have also talked about, they have not really addressed the issue of individual suffering explicitly. They have simply viewed it as inevitable for the process of evolutionary progress, without necessarily giving us any form of logic or analysis for this. They have kept on repeating it and simply giving some examples without explaining why it is so. What they have basically done is they have said that suffering is good because suffering is sacrifice. Understand that suffering is sacrifice if you voluntarily give yourself to that process of suffering. If you voluntarily believe that if you suffer, you will get progress. However, understand that in most process of evolutionary progress, including the French Revolution, which they kept on going on about, a huge people who actually suffered, who actually died, were those people who did not want to sacrifice, but those people who did not believe that this is going to be good for society, but those people who did individual suffering because some other people believe that what they believed is objective, and through this process of accepting individual suffering, they gain moral objectivity to kill those people, to hang those people, to guillotine those people. That is entirely what is wrong with the proposition today. And then they come up and say they want to respect them. Throughout the debate, they are saying that the aristocracy was bad. It was right that they were guillotined. Then they are saying that we respect the aristocracy because they were guillotined. The amount of contradictions that are inherent in the proposition's case today simply cannot be ignored. They advance an entirely faulty argument. They do not engage with our points of information. They rest their principles on arbitrary notions of what well-being and suffering are, of how evolutionary progress affects society as a whole, while we believe the complexity and the conflicts of processes of evolutionary progress, which different parts of society live in differently, even if those paths are switched at the result of every evolutionary progress. And therefore, we believe that the opposition has presented a more substantive, logically coherent, and historically accurate case of what exactly has happened in the history of humanity. And that is why we believe that the opposition takes this debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your speech. I would now request the reply speaker from side government to summarize, to make concluding remarks from side government. Amna, are you going to give the reply?
Okay, right. So I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Throughout the course of this debate, we've proven and demonstrated that individual suffering is inevitable with regards to change and development. Let us imagine the world that side opposition has created, right? Because we have mentioned it's a world of stagnation. It's a world bereft of change. Let us take the examples that they gave us, right? They talked about the LGBTQ plus community and their movement. but the opposition can't come here and ignore the individual suffering that took place, which then gave rise to the Rainbow Revolution, and now and that further sparked change. Therefore, the opposition is completely, in order to prove their points, the opposition can't here and completely disregard the struggles that have gone into these movements. Right? We are on side proposition. We accept these movements because we have proposed that this is because the individual suffering is inevitable. In order to further their argument, side opposition is completely ignoring the individual suffering that has taken place by giving us baseless examples such as of the LGBTQ plus community, because they did go through individual suffering, and which gave rise to the Rainbow Revolution. The side opposition is also coming from a stance of privilege, right? When they're talking about, when they speak of that, when they speak that change will, when they speak of how, the side opposition is also coming from a stance of privilege, as they're talking that change will, as they're talking as if change will take place, change will take place on its own, right? Evolutions will happen on their own. We initially came from the stance that during the French Revolution, the third estate had to rise up, right? They had to, they did not have any other choice rather than turn this movement into a radical movement because they wanted their rights. When they talk about how, and also on side proposition, in no way are we glorifying guillotines, as they mentioned very aggressively that too. In no way are we glorifying mass murder, right? In no way are we saying that in no way are we saying that the French Revolution, that the French Revolution and the mass murders that have happened were correct, right? But that is inevitable. We're saying that is what sparked. We're saying that is what sparked change, and in no way we're saying that France turned out to be a perfect democracy. But they can't ignore the fact that it gave rise to a democratic revolution that took place after that, through which many countries followed, right? Most importantly, side opposition has not provided us with a single alternative to individual suffering. Never have they proposed a model that showed us how their world will still progress and will come, and how these evolutions will occur bereft of individual suffering. This alone makes all of their arguments futile, and as they didn't have any counters to support what will their world look like, right? Very aggressively, I may add, the opposition kept talking about how how the opposition kept talking about how in our world we are glorifying a mass murder, but that's simply not true. And they did not show us what can be done otherwise, right? They did not propose any model to show us how can we better the status quo. Their job as opposition was to sort of give us an alternative, which was never done. In our world, we accept and propose that radical movements push forward the cause for change, right? In our world, what we propose is that individual suffering is inevitable, and there is no choice but to accept it, because they do give rise to evolutions that help us in the future, that help the future generation, and we do reap off the benefits of those evolutions. With that, I rest my case.
Thank you, Amna, for that very fine speech. With that, we come to the end of the finals debate. Please give the judges some time to deliberate upon the verdict of the House. I would like to congratulate both the teams for the great debate that we had. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and best of luck for the verdict.
We request the judges to please move to the breakout rooms. And Rajiv sir, we can start with the closing ceremony whenever you are ready. Till the time the judges are just calculating scores.
I've just stopped that recording, and probably once the judges are ready, then we'll start the closing ceremony and we'll start the recording also.
Sorry, sir, I couldn't hear you.
I said I've just stopped the recording, and once the judges are ready and the judgments are ready and all the things are there, then we'll start recording again for the closing ceremony.